Good day. Russia heralded the new year with a particularly impressive firework display, or to be more precise, a second salvo launching of the Tsirkon hypersonic anti-ship missile. We learn from news agencies, Russia's Interfax and Reuters, that around 12 Zircon hypersonic anti-ship missiles was salvo launched in the Arctic on 31st December 2021. Well, it's not exactly certain at what time. Around 10 were launched from a frigate and 2 more from a submarine. Now, we don't have yet the identity of the frigate or of the submarine, but the frigate is certain to be one of the new Admiral Gorshkov class, which is purpose designed to launch Zircon missiles. They can also launch other anti-ship missiles and land attack missiles like Calibre and Onyx, but it's, as I said, specifically purpose designed to launch Zircon missiles. And as to the submarine which launched the Zircon, well, it has to have been one of the 3 Yasen-class submarines which are now in service or in operation at various levels of operation with the Russian Navy. So again, the purpose of this salvo launch, it seems to me, is twofold. Firstly, to demonstrate to the United States the increasing effectiveness of Russia's military capabilities, the fact that they can hit at hypersonic speeds any American warship in the North Atlantic. This is, of course, especially important given that in time of war, as I've said, the US strategic plans involve reinforcing US and NATO forces in Europe by sending convoys of ships across the Atlantic carrying additional US forces and material. So that is now looking increasingly problematic, and that was part of the purpose of the Tsirkon test. The second, I think, is to demonstrate the increasing potency of Russia's surface fleet. The fact that they can salvo launch missiles like this is impressive. It comes sometime after Russia's Borei-class submarines salvo-launched Bulava ship-based intercontinental missiles, something which, as I understand, it's extremely difficult or rare for ballistic missile submarines to be able to do. The Russian Navy has that capability. I'm not entirely certain whether the US Navy does. People on the threads can perhaps explain. And it's this test also, I think, has a further purpose. This latest Tsirkon test, the fact that the Russians have been able to salvo launch 12 of these missiles, all one after the other at incredible speeds, demonstrates something that the Russians have already announced, that the Tsirkon is now in series production. In other words, it's being produced in quantity and it is entering service with the Russian fleet. So this is, as I said, an important, a powerful demonstration of military power heralding the new year. And of course, it's taking place in advance of the important negotiations which I've been discussing at such length, the negotiations that are going to take place in Geneva between the United States and Russia on the 10th of January, in which the Russians will be seeking their legally binding security guarantees for an end to NATO's eastward expansion and for a pullback, a military pullback by NATO from areas close to their borders, in effect from all of the territories of the former Warsaw Pact, including those countries of the former Warsaw Pact which have been admitted to NATO. So, as I said, it's a show of force, it's a show of capability, it's a warning to the United States that Russia now is in a position to take military action, military steps, which were not available to it even during the time when the USSR was at the height of its power, military power, during the Cold War. Russia today has, in some respects at least, overstepped even the Soviet Union's earlier capabilities. Well, it's not just, of course, military displays that the Russians are putting on. As I've discussed in so many programs on this channel and elsewhere, the other major strategic change, geopolitical change, is that, of course, the Russians, in facing the West, no longer feel alone. Now, that's something that, by the way, was not true during the greater part, was true during the greater part of the Cold War. Throughout the Cold War, the Soviet Union essentially confronted the United States and the NATO alliance by itself, depending to a great extent on its own resources. Of course, it had its Warsaw Pact allies, and I think most people who've looked over the history of the Cold War would come to the view that, in economic terms at least, Moscow's Warsaw Pact allies were an economic drain rather than an asset. And in the 1950s, the Soviets also had an ally in China. But of course, the China of the 1950s was an extremely poor country, dwarfed by the power of the two superpowers of that era, the United States and the Soviet Union. And though in theory China added a capability, and potentially it might have done so, in practice and in fact, China in the 1950s was in no sense a viable strategic ally for the Soviets in a conflict with the United States. And in any event, that alliance with China was comparatively brief. In the 1960s, it completely unraveled. China became first an adversary, and then for a period in the 1970s, a de facto ally of the United States, massively complicating Soviet strategic calculations. And then after the Cold War ended, again, the Russians, much reduced in power as they were as a consequence of the Soviet breakup, still found themselves essentially confronting the United States, at this point hugely increased in relative power over themselves, and the NATO alliance in effect by themselves. Throughout the 1990s, China was very much still a developing country, its economy dwarfed by that of the United States, and not remotely comparable in capability to the United States. And even in the 2000s, when the Chinese economy grew exponentially in size and power, it still seemed, despite a certain improvement, in fact a great improvement in Sino-Russian relations that happened during that period, but it still seemed to be the case that China was continuing to prioritize its relationship with the United States. So Russia found itself in the 1990s. Of course, it was going through a major political and economic crisis over the course of that period, and a social and demographic crisis as well. But in the 1990s, it was essentially on its own, and in fact came very close to becoming a US satellite. And in the 2000s, its geopolitical position marginally improved, and its economic position greatly improved, but still, to a great extent, it was still faced with the immense power of the United States and of the Western alliance, reduced to its own very limited, very reduced resources. Well, that again is no longer the case. Just as we've seen a huge increase in Russian military power, as the Tsirkon test demonstrates, so we've seen a radical change in Russia's geostrategic situation. Whereas previously it had been confronting the United States and the collective West by itself, now it has a friend which is better than an ally. And moreover, that friend is a country whose economy in terms of purchasing power parity is actually bigger than the United States, and whose manufacturing capacity is far bigger than the United States. That's not to deny that China's economy doesn't have great problems, as of course Russia's also does. But from a Russian point of view, the fact that that Russia today has in China not just a friend, but an immensely powerful friend, something which, to reiterate, the China of the 1950s was not, that of course has given the Russians a strategic depth and a strategic weight in confronting the United States and the Western powers, such as has not been the case until now. And the extent to which there's been this change, this geopolitical change, has been underlined by the New Year's greetings that the senior officials of the Chinese and Russian governments have exchanged with each other. Now, the best place to find these are on the Chinese Foreign Ministry's website. The Russians are always very slow on New Year's Day, which is of course for them a holiday, to publish their versions of these exchanges. But I've no reason to think that the versions that the Chinese are publishing are in any way going to differ in any material or significant way from the Russian versions, the Russian readouts, when we eventually get them. And in some ways, anyway, these readouts, the readouts that the Chinese and the Russians of the exchanges that they've had on New Year's Day, well, they're not hugely interesting. These are, after all, New Year greetings. They're friendly exchanges of messages. They're not going to contain much of diplomatic and political substance. Friendly greetings on a holiday are not really a good moment or a good time or a good place for that sort of thing. But perhaps what's most striking, and the thing that really stands out for me, is how extensive this exchange of greetings is. So we see that the Chinese and Russian presidents, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, have exchanged New Year greetings. You find a complete readout of that on the Chinese Foreign Ministry website. The Chinese Prime Minister and the Russian Prime Minister, Li Keqiang and Mikhail Mishustin, have also exchanged New Year greetings. Well, that's unusual, but perhaps it's not completely unique. But bear in mind, it's a sign that Li Keqiang and Mishustin consider each other friends, and perhaps it underscores the extent to which there is now friendship and cooperation between the Chinese and the Russians at an operational level. I think this is a point which perhaps might be worth explaining to some of our, my American viewers. In the Chinese and Russian system, the president, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, is in charge of overall strategic direction. The president gives overall directives which are binding on the government, and he supervises the work of the government. But the actual operation, the actual day-to-day work, the organization of work, the place where the actual machinery of government takes place, and where the hard work and hard grind, if you like, takes place, that happens at a level just below, at the level of the Prime Minister and the government. And so Li Keqiang and Mikhail Mishustin are there to actually work out and carry out the actual day-to-day running of the various plans hatched by their presidents, and to make sure that those plans are actually put into effect and that they're actually brought into fruition and that they work efficiently and effectively at an active basis. So, if you like, the presidents deal with things at a sort of strategic and planning level. The prime ministers do things at a kind of operational level. The nearest approximation to this in the US system, the nearest approximation to a prime minister, a Russian or Chinese prime minister in the American system, is the White House Chief of Staff. But of course, the White House Chief of Staff's position is vastly circumvented in the American system, and there is no exact analogue. The Chinese and the Russian system, the presidential system, is actually very different from the American, and perhaps it's difficult to exactly to compare the two precisely, with the president in the United States carrying out many of the functions, or required to carry out many of the functions, that in China and Russia the prime minister does. Whether someone like Joseph Biden is able to carry out those functions, those day-to-day operational functions, is of course another matter. But anyway, the fact that these two people, Li Keqiang and Mikhail Mishustin, exchange New Year greetings, shows the depth of coordination between the Russians and the Chinese. It's not just a case of strategic cooperation or cooperation at the strategic level between presidents. It is a detailed, day-to-day coordination at the level of practical government. And that is unusual, and in today's world, I think, practically unique. And then, of course, there was another person or persons who exchanged New Year greetings within the Chinese-Russian governmental hierarchies, and that was the two foreign ministers, Wang Yi and Sergei Lavrov. And we've had a very long and detailed readout about this. Now, some of the reports I've seen, especially in the Russian media, have talked about Wang Yi telling Lavrov that the two countries should stand shoulder to shoulder in the battle against hegemony. Might be an accurate reproduction of what Wang Yi said, though I stress we've had no official English language readout yet from the Russian Foreign Ministry. But I have to say the Chinese readout of this exchange is somewhat more measured. What we have the Chinese readout say, what it reports Wang Yi as having said, is something which is essentially the same as what these Russian media reports are saying. But as I said, it's it's not quite as, potent and perhaps as blunt as those Russian media reports indicate. The Chinese readout reads on this issue, the two countries have communicated and coordinated closely in the international arena, together raised the voice of justice in defense of democracy and human rights. and always upheld the right path of true multilateralism, which has injected valuable impetus and confidence into the turbulent world. In the new year, I, that is to say Wang Yi, am ready to stay in close communication with Foreign Minister Lavrov through various manners, fully implement various consensuses reached by the two heads of state, that's to say Putin and Xi, further deepen the comprehensive strategic cooperation in the new era, make concerted efforts to safeguard the common interests of both sides, and make unremitting endeavours to promote the building of a new type of international relations and a community with a shared future for mankind. That's the Chinese readout. Now, in effect, it says the same as some of those Russian news reports, but it doesn't go quite so far. I'm going to add, by the way, that there is also a change here as well. Until fairly recently, Lavrov and Wang Yi, or at least Lavrov and whoever was his Chinese foreign ministry counterpart, they didn't visibly coordinate quite as closely as they do today. Most of the coordination at the level of the Russian and Chinese governments in terms of foreign policy was not done by the foreign ministers. It was done by the chiefs of staff of the respective presidents. Now, recently, over the last couple of years, some sort of decision appears to have been made that the pretense that there is no foreign policy coordination should be put aside, and so we now have open coordination and cooperation between the foreign ministers of China and Russia. And of course, we learn and discover that the two, Wang Yi and Lavrov, have come to think of each other as friends. And we have a really rather interesting description in the Chinese readout of Lavrov's words. We read, for example, Lavrov saying, this is of course the Chinese readout, despite the constraints of the pandemic, I have maintained regular contacts with State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi, including 4 offline meetings, which have further strengthened the role of the China-Russia team in international affairs. 4 offline meetings? What does that mean exactly? I suspect what it means is 4 telephone discussions which have not been reported or mentioned about previously. So that's a way for the Russians and the Chinese to disclose the fact that the Russians and the Chinese speak to each other regularly without necessarily providing readouts of their calls or even disclosing that those calls have taken place. But perhaps even more striking is this reference to a China-Russia team in international affairs. So we're not just friends, we're not just cooperating with each other, we are actually a team. We are part of the same team. We play together like we're 2 members, we're each a member of a single team. It's quite a remarkable thing to see said so straightforwardly. And it gives, again, a sense of the enormous cooperation that the Chinese and the Russians are undertaking with each other. Now, I know there's many people on these threads who think that this is an incredibly unbalanced relationship, that China is getting all the benefits, Russia is far and away the weakest partner, all those things. I don't agree with much of this. I think clearly China has the predominant role in this relationship. But I think that the view that it is as uneven as is being said is wrong. And by the way, I think that it's a complete misconception to think that China is getting stronger and Russia weaker within this relationship. I would say, if anything, it is Russia that is in the ascendant. I don't mean to suggest that it's going to overtake Beijing. I mean, that's obviously not going to happen. But I think the biggest and most dramatic changes in the last 10 years have been in the increase in Russian power, both military and technological, and by the way, economic. That's a separate topic I'm going to look at in another program. But what I would say is that regardless of what you think about this relationship, about who is the winner and who is the loser, it does highlight the problem that the United States and the West are now facing, which is that they are up against a united team which is potentially, at least, in fact, in many respects, stronger in its aggregate resources than they are. Now, that has never been true before. It has never been true at any point since the Second World War. Wasn't true, by the way, in the Second World War either. Once the United States joined the war in 1941, the Western powers were far outmatched the power of their enemies, of their adversaries, Germany and Japan. And you could argue that in reality, the most powerful countries, the countries which had the greatest degree of military, economic and political power and heft in the world, have been the English-speaking countries, and that this has been true ever since the defeat in the early 19th century of Napoleon Bonaparte. So it gives you a sense of how radically things have changed or are changing, that for the first time, arguably since that period, in the early 19th century, the English-speaking nations find themselves in aggregate outmatched by an alliance, because it is an alliance in all but name, that has greater aggregate resources than they do. And let me repeat and reiterate again, this is one of the fundamental reasons why we suddenly see this major hardening in Russian foreign policy in Eastern Europe, in Europe, why the Russians are able to make the kind of demands that they've never made before, and why the United States, far from throwing those demands into the dustbin and telling the Russians, you are insane, what nonsense are you talking about? Why, instead of saying that, the Americans find themselves in this difficult position of having to sit down and talk about things which, to be straightforward about it, they would much rather not talk about. And the same is going to be true before very long over issues of the Asia-Pacific region. And on that topic, I would add that there's been yet another case of Russian and Chinese interaction, because we learned that there's been talks in the Chinese Foreign Ministry between one of China's deputy foreign ministers and the Russian ambassador discussing the Indo-Pacific region, the Asia-Pacific region, and talking about policy coordination there as well. And that meeting has also taken place over the last couple of days. So the Americans, both in the Pacific and in Europe, are faced with Team China-Russia. Something, as I said, they've never experienced before, and it is posing enormous problems, huge issues for them. Now, To be very clear, it's not game over. The United States still has many cards, very strong cards, left to play. There are ways that the United States can, in my opinion, play those cards well and maneuver itself back into a strong position. Though I doubt that it will ever achieve that position of ascendancy that it once had. I think personally, despite the problems, the problems in China and Russia, I think that period of ascendancy has forever gone. Quite apart from anything else, it seems to me that the problems that China and Russia face, though very great, are solvable and containable, whereas the problems that the United States and its European allies face, it seems to me, are much greater and far more intractable. But anyway, there we are. If you want me to say what is the big story of 2021, the year that has just passed, it is the appearance of Team China-Russia. Single team. Lavrov apparently has actually spoken about it. He's disclosed the fact that it exists. Team Russia and China. And as the Tsirkon test on the new year shows, that team is big and rich and getting bigger. Thank you for joining me for this program today. May I take this opportunity to wish you all a very happy new year, to thank you all for your support over the course of 2021, to ask you to continue to bear with me for my channel, and to hope that perhaps you did gain some help and insight and information from it. And may I wish you all again, as I said, a happy new year for yourselves and for your families, and to remind you that you can find me on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou, and also, of course, on Locals, where we have our thriving community. And you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar by going to our shop, and you can also support us by subscribing to my channel and by taking the like button to this video. Thank you again for all your friendship and all your support. Have a wonderful year in 2022, and have a very good day as well.